Back in the year of 1878, the land stretched wide and hard under a sky that was more often pale with dust or bruised with storms than it was a gentle blue. Out here, on the fringes of settled territory, life was stripped down to bone and muscle, a constant wrestling match with the elements and the stubborn, untamed earth. Men worked until their hands bled and their backs ached, wrestling fences into existence, coaxing grudging life from the soil, and facing down the loneliness that settled deep in the marrow like the winter cold. Thomas Becket was one such man, built like the sturdy fence posts he drove into the prairie, weathered and quiet, his face etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and a grief that had carved out a hollow space inside him years ago. He ran a small ranch, isolated miles from the nearest settlement, a collection of rough-hewn buildings and dust-choked streets known, with a grim sort of humor, as Prosperity Creek. Prosperity was a fleeting notion out here, clinging to the edges of existence like a starved coyote. Thomas's ranch was barely more than a cabin and a few outbuildings, a scatter of cattle his sole company most days. He was a capable man, strong and resourceful, but beneath the stoic exterior lay a quiet despair. His wife, Mary, had died 5 years prior, taking with her not just his heart, but the future they had planned. They had dreamed of a family, of small hands helping with chores, of laughter echoing in the cabin, but Mary had been frail, and the land was unforgiving. After her death, Thomas had buried that dream alongside her, packing it away like precious, fragile things in the back of his mind, too painful to touch. The silence in the cabin was a constant, heavy presence, a reminder of what was lost and what would never be. The doctor had told him, gently but plainly, after a riding accident years before Mary, that children were not in his future. The words had fallen like stones into the well of his hope, hitting bottom with a final, echoing splash. Mary had known, of course, and her love had been steadfast, but the unspoken weight of that fact had been another burden they carried, quietly, together. Now, alone, the impossibility of a child felt like the ultimate barrenness, reflecting the emptiness within. He was a man who worked the land, sought growth, but was himself incapable of fostering new life. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. He had built fences, cleared fields, raised cattle, all acts of creation, yet the one creation that mattered most was forever out of reach. This sterile truth had calcified around his grief, hardening him, pushing him further into himself, making the isolation less a circumstance and more a chosen state. The world beyond his fences felt increasingly alien. The westward push brought new faces, new conflicts. Rumors drifted to Prosperity Creek of the Comanche, their lands shrinking, their way of life under siege. Stories, often cruel and devoid of understanding, were told in the saloon, tales of raids, of resistance, painted always in shades of savage violence. There were whispers, too, of government camps, places where displaced tribes were held, ostensibly for their own good, but more often places of squalor and despair. Thomas usually tuned out the talk, focusing only on the practicalities of survival, the price of cattle, the forecast of the next storm. He had no quarrel with anyone, wanted only to be left alone. But then, something shifted. A circuit rider, passing through the sparsely populated area, stopped at Thomas's ranch seeking shelter from a sudden squall. Over weak coffee, the man spoke not of sermons, but of the state of things, the grim reality of the work camps. He spoke of desperation, of conditions that led people to unthinkable acts. He spoke of a particular camp, further south, notorious for its harshness, where families had been broken, and people were treated less than human. He mentioned, almost as an aside, something that snagged in the desolate corners of Thomas's mind. Women, some young, were being offered, a polite word for sold, to men who wanted wives or labor, Comanche women. The word Comanche barely registered. It was the word offered, the cold transaction, that struck him. And then a half-formed thought, born not of desire, but of a deep, aching practicality and perhaps a flicker of something he dared not name, began to take root. A woman, a helper. Someone to break the silence. The idea was raw, uncomfortable, born of a sterile need, not a tender one. It felt transactional, brutal even, like buying a workhorse. But the silence, the endless pressing silence, it was a beast that was slowly devouring him. And the knowledge that children were impossible meant the ache for connection took a different, perhaps less conventional, form. He wasn't seeking a wife in the traditional sense. He was seeking a cessation of the silence, a presence, a buffer against the encroaching emptiness. The infertility, once a source of grief, now seemed to grant a strange, distorted permission for this thought. A wife meant hopes, meant dreams of a future he couldn't build. A purchased woman from a desperate situation, that was something else. Something starker, perhaps less likely to awaken the ghosts of Mary and the lost future. He wrestled with the idea for weeks. It felt wrong, deeply wrong, to buy another human being. His conscience, quiet but persistent, pricked at him. But the circuit rider had painted a grim picture of the camp, of people starving, of women facing fates far worse than a lonely rancher's cabin. Was it rescue, in a twisted way? Or was it simply giving in to his own needs, using another's desperation? The lines blurred in the harsh light of his isolation. The silence, the gnawing loneliness, the sheer physical labor required to keep the ranch afloat, it was wearing him down. He needed help, he needed something. The journey south was long and dusty. Thomas rode with a grim resolve, his pockets holding the sum total of years of careful saving. The camp was worse than the circuit rider had described. A collection of tents and lean-tos surrounded by a makeshift fence, guarded by men with bored, cruel eyes. The air hung thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and despair. People moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes dulled. He found the man in charge, a greasy individual named Brody, who sat behind a rough table counting coins. Brody didn't look up when Thomas stated his purpose. He simply gestured towards a section of the camp. "Pick one. Price is fixed, no returns." Thomas walked through the designated area, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He felt a profound sense of shame, a cold knot tightening in his gut. The women stood or sat, some staring blankly, others avoiding his gaze. They were thin, their clothes ragged, their eyes holding a terrible ancient sorrow. They were not meeting his eyes, their faces masks of resignation or weariness. And then he saw her. She sat apart from the others, near the fence, her back straight despite her thinness. She was young, perhaps 20 or so. Her face, though gaunt, held a striking dignity. Her hair was dark, braided neatly. Her eyes, when they flickered up and met his for just a second, were dark and intelligent, holding not resignation, but a spark of something else, perhaps defiance, perhaps just a deep, private sorrow. They were not dulled like the others. They seemed to see him, truly see him, not just as another potential buyer, but as a man standing there, awkward and out of place. He stopped in front of her. She didn't shrink away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Her," Thomas said, his voice rough. Brody grinned, a flash of yellow teeth. "Ah, Nahili, the quiet one. Thinks she's too good for everyone, might need a firm hand." Thomas ignored Brody. He looked at the girl, Nahili. Her name felt strange on his tongue, foreign. He didn't know what a firm hand meant to Brody, but he knew he didn't like the implication. He wasn't here to break anyone. He was here because he was broken. He paid the money, counted out coin by coin onto the rough table. Brody made them sign a paper, full of legal jargon Thomas barely understood, but the gist was clear: ownership. He felt the weight of the transaction settle on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. Brody tossed a worn blanket towards Nahili. "Get your things." She had nothing. A small, bundled piece of cloth was all she carried. She rose gracefully, her movements fluid despite her apparent weakness. She didn't look at Brody, didn't look at the others. Her eyes found Thomas's just for a moment, and in them he saw a flicker of something he couldn't decipher. Fear, yes, but something else too. Resilience? Judgment? He didn't know. The ride back was silent. Nahili rode behind him on the horse, her hand light on his waist. He could feel the fragile bones through the thin fabric of her dress. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't know what to say. He had just bought a human being. The reality of it was stark, ugly. He wasn't a slave owner. He was a rancher, a widower, a man who couldn't have children. What was he doing? When they arrived at the ranch, the cabin felt even smaller, the silence even louder, now filled with the unspoken weight of Nahili's presence. He dismounted and offered her a hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly steady. "My name is Thomas," he said, the first words he'd spoken to her directly. She nodded. She didn't offer her name, though he'd heard Brody say it. He didn't press. He showed her the cabin. It was simple, clean but Spartan. His life was Spartan. He showed her the small cot in the corner. "You can sleep there. There's food." He cooked a simple meal, beans and bacon. They ate in silence at the small table. Thomas watched her from the corner of his eye. She ate slowly, deliberately, not like someone starving, but like someone savoring each bite. There was a quiet strength in her, a composure that defied her circumstances. It unnerved him slightly. He had expected someone broken, weeping perhaps, or defiant in a loud, angry way. Not this quiet dignity. The first few weeks were a study in silence and observation. They moved around each other like wary animals, assessing, measuring. Thomas worked the ranch, rising before dawn, returning at dusk. Nahili stayed near the cabin. He didn't ask her to do anything at first, unsure of what was expected, or what he could expect. She seemed to understand the rhythm of the days. She cleaned the cabin without being asked, quietly and efficiently. She washed their clothes in a tub outside. She watched him. He felt her eyes on him sometimes, curious, perhaps judgmental. He learned small things about her by watching. She woke before him, sitting outside the cabin sometimes as the first light touched the prairie, her face turned towards the east. She seemed to communicate with the land, with the sky, in a way he didn't understand. She moved with a quiet grace, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. She spoke only when necessary, her voice soft, her English halting but understandable. She asked for nothing. He, in turn, revealed little. He kept his routine, his grief a silent wall around him. He didn't speak of Mary, didn't speak of the infertility, didn't speak of the ache that drove him to this strange arrangement. He simply provided food, shelter, safety from the outside world. Safety from Brody, from the camp, from whatever future she might have faced. It was a practical transaction, he told himself, a solution to loneliness and the need for help, for both of them perhaps. A cold, necessary thing. One evening, a sudden storm blew in, fierce and fast. The wind howled like a thing grieving, tearing at the cabin's shutters, rattling the very foundations. Rain lashed down, blurring the world outside. Thomas was securing a loose board when he saw Nahili standing in the doorway, watching the storm, not with fear, but with a strange intensity. "This is a big wind," he commented, stating the obvious, just to break the roar of the storm. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. "The land is angry," she said simply. He paused. The land was not angry, it was weather. But the way she said it, the belief in her voice, gave him pause. It wasn't just dirt and rock and grass to her, it was alive. "Just a storm," he said, more gently than he intended. "It washes away the dust," she said, looking back out, "makes things clean again." He considered that. Maybe it did. He finished securing the board and came inside. The cabin felt small and safe amidst the fury outside. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. Nahili sat on her cot, watching the fire. Were you taken?" he asked, the question coming out abruptly, surprising even himself. He hadn't intended to ask about her past. It felt invasive. She was silent for a long moment. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, she spoke. "My family, gone. Sickness. White man's sickness. The soldiers came, said I had no one. Took me to the camp." Her voice was flat, devoid of outward emotion, but the weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air. Gone. Family. Sickness. Soldiers. Camp. A life reduced to harsh, definitive words. His own grief, the carefully buried pain of Mary's loss, stirred within him, a familiar ache. He didn't know what to say. There were no words for that kind of loss, that kind of injustice. "I am sorry," he said, the words inadequate, foolish even, against the scale of her suffering. She looked at him again, those dark, intelligent eyes. "You bought me." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Yes," he admitted, the shame returning. "From Brody," he said. "I know what he said," she interrupted, her voice still soft, but with an edge he hadn't heard before. "He sells people like horses." "I needed help," he said, feeling defensive, then immediately hating himself for it. It sounded weak, self-serving. "And I needed Away, she finished for him. Away from there. She looked back at the fire. It is better here. The land, it is quiet, like my home used to be. It's a lonely place, he said. Lonely is better than dying slow, she replied, her gaze fixed on the flames. That night, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer just the emptiness he had grown accustomed to. It was a shared silence, filled with unspoken histories and the raw, fragile beginnings of something tentative and undefined. As the weeks turned into months, a rhythm developed between them. Nahili began to work alongside him, not because he demanded it, but because she chose to. She had an uncanny understanding of the land, of the animals. She knew where the best herbs grew, how to track, how to find water in unlikely places. She was quiet, efficient, and strong in a way that surprised him. She didn't complain about the hard work, didn't shy away from the dirt or the sun. He taught her about the cattle, about fences, about planting the small garden. She taught him, without words mostly, about patience, about observing the subtle language of the natural world. They worked side by side, the only sounds the wind, the lowing of cattle, the ring of his hammer, the soft tread of her feet. Slowly, cautiously, the wall around Thomas began to crumble. Her quiet resilience, her unspoken grief that mirrored his own in a strange way, reached something deep inside him. He saw her not as a possession, not as a Comanche woman, not even just as a helper. He saw Nahili, a person, a survivor, a quiet, dignified soul. One hot afternoon, the sun beat down relentlessly. They were mending a fence line far from the cabin. Thomas swung the hammer, sweat stinging his eyes. He stumbled, his leg cramping painfully. He swore, dropping the hammer. Nahili was instantly by his side. She didn't ask questions. She simply knelt, her fingers finding the knotted muscle in his calf. Her touch was firm, knowledgeable. She worked the cramp out with steady pressure, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Better?" she asked when she finished, her voice low. "Yes," he breathed, surprised by the relief. "Thank you." She nodded, gathering his tools. "We go back now. Sun too hot." He looked at her, at the simple care in her actions, the lack of fuss. It was the first time someone had touched him with kindness in years. The feeling was startling, unfamiliar, like coming across a hidden spring in the desert. Back at the cabin, she made a cool drink from roots she had gathered. She didn't hover, just offered it, and went back to her quiet tasks. He watched her, a new kind of awareness stirring within him. This wasn't just a transaction anymore. Somewhere along the miles of silent riding, along the weeks of shared meals and quiet work, something else had begun to grow. Dialogue became less strained, less functional. They talked about the weather, the land, the animals. He learned more about her past, snippets offered reluctantly, but offered nonetheless. Stories of her family, her tribe, their connection to the earth. He shared tentatively about his ranch, about Mary, skirting the edges of the deepest pain, but acknowledging the loss. He didn't mention the infertility. That felt too vulnerable, too shameful still. One evening, after the stars had come out, painting the vast sky with glittering patterns, they were sitting outside, enjoying the cooler air. "Your wife," Nahili said softly, breaking a long silence. "You miss her much." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a recognition of a truth he carried openly, even in his silence. "Every day," he admitted, his voice thick. "She was everything." "It is good to miss," Nahili said. "It means they were important. My mother, my father, my sister, I miss them. Like the wind misses the trees that are cut down." It was a strange poetic way of putting it, but he understood. A missing presence, a shape that was no longer there, leaving an empty space where movement and life used to be. He looked at her, silhouetted against the night sky. He saw her grief, raw and immense, yet she carried it with such quiet strength. And he saw, perhaps for the first time, the shared burden they both carried, the loneliness that had brought them together in this unlikely way. "We are both missing things," he said, the words feeling small against the enormity of their losses. She nodded slowly. "But maybe we can find new things, not the same, but light in the dark." Light in the dark. Was that what this was? Was he, a lonely, infertile rancher who had bought a woman, finding light in the dark with a Comanche girl who had lost everything? The idea was terrifying, fragile, and held a quiet possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Their connection deepened, slow and steady like a river carving a canyon. There was no grand declaration, no sudden shift. It was in the shared glance over the dinner table, the comfortable silence as they worked, the way she seemed to know what he needed before he asked. He found himself anticipating her quiet presence, looking forward to the end of the day when they would share the small cabin. He started leaving out small things for her, a ribbon he found in Prosperity Creek, a smooth stone from the creek bed, a wildflower he thought was pretty. She accepted them with a simple nod, a soft look from those dark eyes that spoke volumes. He began to see the prejudice in the nearby town more clearly now. When he went in for supplies, the storekeeper's questions felt sharper, the glances of the townsfolk harder. "Still got that Injun woman out there, Beckett?" They'd ask, their voices laced with disapproval or lewd suggestion. He felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. Nahili was not an Injun woman, she was Nahili. And she was with him. This growing connection, this tentative bond, was not lost on the outside world. A group of cattle rustlers, drifters who preyed on isolated ranches, rode through the territory. They saw Thomas's small spread, saw the smoke from his chimney, and saw opportunity. They also saw, or heard rumors of, the Comanche woman living there. Their cruel minds twisted the facts, seeing not a woman seeking refuge, but something to be exploited, something vulnerable and outside the protection of their twisted version of society's rules. The conflict arrived on a clear, hot afternoon. Thomas was out mending a distant fence when he heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin at a run. His gut clenched. Ranchers didn't ride like that unless there was trouble. He dropped his tools and sprinted back towards the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into the small clearing to find 3 men on horseback outside his cabin. One was dismounted, swaggering towards the door. Another was laughing, holding a rope, his eyes fixed on the cabin. The third sat on his horse, watching, a rifle slung across his lap. They were rough-looking men, their faces hard and cruel. "Hey, Beckett!" the dismounted man yelled, his voice slurred with whiskey. "Heard you got yourself a squaw. We figure she belongs to the territory, not one man. We'll take turns." Rage, cold and pure, surged through Thomas. They weren't just threatening his property, they were threatening Nahili. The protective instinct, long dormant, flared into a burning fire. He didn't hesitate. He didn't have his rifle, but he had his hammer. He charged towards them, yelling, a wild sound torn from his throat. The men turned, surprised by his sudden attack. The one with the rope dropped it, fumbling for his pistol. The dismounted man stumbled back. The man on the horse raised his rifle. Thomas didn't stop. He swung the hammer, hitting the dismounted man in the shoulder. The man roared, dropping his pistol. Thomas lunged for it, scooping it up from the dust. The man on the horse fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Thomas's feet. He ducked behind a water trough, raising the stolen pistol. Just then, the cabin door burst open. Nahili stood there, not cowering, but holding Thomas's rifle, steady in her hands. He hadn't taught her to shoot it, but she had clearly watched him, learned its weight, how he aimed. She raised the rifle, aimed deliberately at the man on the horse, the biggest threat. The rifle cracked. The man cried out, clutching his arm, the rifle clattering to the ground. The other 2 men stared, stunned by the shot and the sight of the Comanche woman standing there, holding the rifle like she meant business. "Get out!" Thomas roared, stepping out from behind the trough, the pistol aimed steadily at the man with the injured arm. "Get out, and don't ever come back." The rustlers exchanged nervous glances. They were outnumbered, hurt, and clearly hadn't expected this kind of resistance, especially not from the woman. The man with the injured arm cursed, his face pale. "This ain't over, Beckett," the dismounted man snarled, scrambling back towards his horse. "Yes it is," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Ride." They scrambled onto their horses, leaving the dropped pistol and rope behind. They spurred their horses and galloped away, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Thomas stood there for a moment, breathing hard, the adrenaline coursing through him. He lowered the pistol, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at Nahili. She still stood in the doorway, the rifle held ready. Her face was calm, determined. He walked towards her, towards the cabin. When he reached her, she lowered the rifle. Her eyes met his. They were clear, steady, and filled with a silent strength that took his breath away. "You knew how to use that," he said, stating the obvious again. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I watched you." "You saved me," he said. "We saved each other," she replied softly. In that moment, standing in the doorway of his small, rough cabin, the dust settling from the aborted attack, the bond between them solidified. It wasn't just about practical necessity anymore. It was about courage, loyalty, and a shared defiance against a world that wanted to break them both. The word "bought" felt like a distant echo, a sound from another life. It had brought them together, yes, but what had grown between them was something that could never be bought or sold. The aftermath of the confrontation changed things irrevocably. News traveled fast, even in the sparse territory. The story of the quiet rancher and the Comanche woman who defended their home with a rifle became a local legend, twisted and exaggerated with each telling. For some in Prosperity Creek, it confirmed their prejudices. The wild Injun woman was dangerous. But for others, it forced a grudging respect for Thomas Becket and the unlikely partnership he had forged. He had defended his property, yes, but he had also defended her. Thomas didn't care about the talk. All that mattered was the quiet understanding that now flowed between him and Nahili. The barriers were gone, replaced by a deep, mutual trust forged in shared danger. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was comfortable, filled with the quiet presence of another soul. He began to rely on her judgment, on her knowledge of the land. She was more than a helper, she was a partner. He shared the decisions about the ranch with her, listening intently to her quiet observations. Her insights were often profound, rooted in a connection to the earth he could only admire. The infertility remained, a physical reality, a private sorrow he still carried. But the crushing weight of it had lessened. He couldn't have children of his blood, but he wasn't barren in spirit. He was nurturing something else, a bond, a partnership, a shared life built on mutual respect and affection. He had found a different kind of family, one not defined by blood, but by resilience, shared hardship, and unexpected connection. One evening, months after the attack, they were sitting outside as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors. It was a familiar ritual now, a quiet moment of shared peace at the end of the day. "Thomas," Nahili said, using his name easily now, "your sorrow, it is quieter now." He looked at her, surprised she had noticed, surprised she would voice it. "Yes," he admitted, "it is. The missing piece, it is still there," she said, her gaze steady, "but it does not fill everything." "No," he agreed, the words feeling true in a way they hadn't before. "It doesn't." He hesitated, then decided to speak a truth he had held back for so long. "Mary and I, we wanted children, couldn't have them. Doctor said I couldn't, after an accident. That's part of the quiet." He watched her face, braced for, he didn't know what, pity, disappointment. She was silent for a moment, processing his confession. Then, she reached out, her fingers gently touching his arm. It was a simple gesture, but the tenderness in it was immense. "The spirits give life in many ways," she said softly, "not just one way. A plant grows, a calf is born, a bond grows between two people. These are also life." He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Her eyes were full of understanding, acceptance. She wasn't judging him, wasn't pitying him. She was simply seeing him. "Nahili," he said, his voice rough with emotion, I never thought I could have this quiet." "This is home now," she said, sweeping her hand to encompass the cabin, the fences, the wide open land around them. "Our home." Our home, the word settled deep within him, filling the hollow space that grief and loneliness had carved out. It wasn't the home he had planned, the future he had dreamed of with Mary. It was something different, something unexpected, born from hardship and injustice, but nurtured by resilience and a connection that transcended prejudice and circumstance. They built their life together on that quiet ranch. The physical scars of their pasts remained, unseen but present. The world outside still held its prejudices, its dangers. But within the fences of their home, they found a refuge, a partnership, a quiet love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. Thomas Becket, the infertile cowboy, and Nahili, the Comanche girl bought from a harsh camp, had found not just survival, but something infinitely more precious. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found their soulmate. The land, once a reflection of Thomas's barrenness, now felt fertile with the quiet promise of a future built together, day by painstaking day, under the wide, forgiving sky. Their story became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for unexpected kindness to blossom in the harshest soil, and the profound truth that home is not just a place, but a bond forged between souls who choose to face the world together, finding belonging where they least expected it.
The wind in the high plains of the Dakota Territory carried the memory of winter, a final, sharp tooth in the jaw of spring. It was a lonely sound, the only companion Winona had known for 5 seasons. It whipped through the sparse pines and scoured the granite faces of the hills, speaking a language of solitude she had come to understand as her own. In the year of 1884, the world had shrunk to the size of this rocky, forgotten patch of land, and her life had become a rhythm of survival, as steady and stark as a heartbeat in the immense silence. She moved through the undergrowth with a quietness that was less a skill and more a state of being. Her feet, clad in worn moccasins, knew the language of every twig and stone. She was checking her snares, her gaze sweeping the familiar landscape, noting the faintest disturbances, the track of a coyote, the nervous flight of a sparrow. It was then that she saw it. A disruption not made by any creature she knew, a darkness against the pale sky that did not belong. It was a shape hanging from the thickest branch of a cottonwood that stood defiant in a shallow ravine. Her breath caught, a small, sharp snag in her chest. For a long moment, she remained perfectly still, melting back into the shadows of the pines. Her first instinct, honed by years of loss and flight, was to turn and disappear. Whatever trouble hung from that tree was the trouble of the white man, and their trouble was a plague she had learned to avoid at all costs. It had already taken everything from her, her family, her people, her place in the world. But she did not leave. Something held her rooted to the spot, a grim curiosity, perhaps, or the ghost of a compassion she thought had long since died. The wind turned the hanging shape slowly, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of a man. He was suspended not by the neck, but by his hands, which were bound together and thrown over the branch. His head lolled forward, a dead weight on his chest. From this distance he appeared to be gone, another piece of grim refuse left to the scavengers of the plains. Against her better judgment, she began to move closer, her approach as cautious as a doe nearing a salt lick. The scent of fear and sweat reached her first, a sour tang on the cold air. Then she saw the raw, chafed flesh of his wrists, the dark lines of dried blood tracking down his arms. His boots were gone, his feet bare and bruised. His shirt had been ripped from him, leaving his torso exposed to the biting wind. And then she saw the brand. Seared across the pale skin of his chest, in ugly, weeping letters, were 2 words: Indian lover. The letters were a crude mockery of print, a declaration of hate burned into flesh. The sight of it struck a dissonant chord deep inside her. It was a brand of shame, a punishment meant to mark and ostracize. It was a violence she understood intimately, for she wore her own version of it not on her skin, but in the marrow of her bones, in the solitude that had become her life. This man, this stranger, had been condemned for a crime that tied his fate, however violently, to her people. She reached the base of the tree and looked up at him. His face was obscured by a tangle of sweat-dampened brown hair. A low groan, so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind, escaped his lips. He was alive. The knowledge landed in her stomach like a stone. Leaving a dead man to the crows was one thing. Leaving a living one to suffer the same fate was another. It was a choice she did not want. Her peaceful, empty world was a fragile thing, built on the principle of non-interference. This man was a breach, a gaping wound in the fabric of her isolation. Her jaw tightened. She looked at the raw, brutal letters on his chest again. The men who did this were white men. They hated him for the same reason they hated her. A strange, bitter kinship formed in that moment, thin as a spider's thread but undeniably there. He was an enemy of her enemies. It was not kindness that moved her then, but a cold, hard logic of survival. Perhaps it was a defiance she had forgotten she possessed. To leave him here would be to let those men win. To save him was to spit in their eye, a silent act of rebellion in a world that had silenced her. She drew the knife from the sheath at her belt. The blade was worn but sharp, its edge maintained with meticulous care. Reaching up, she began to saw at the thick rope binding his wrists. It was slow, arduous work. His dead weight pulled the rope taut, making each stroke of the knife a struggle. His body swayed with her efforts, and another pained murmur slipped from his throat. Finally, with a loud snap, the rope gave way. He collapsed in a heap at the foot of the tree, a disjointed tangle of limbs. He did not move. For a terrifying second, she thought the fall had finished him. She knelt, placing 2 fingers against the side of his neck. A pulse, faint and thready, beat against her skin. It was a stubborn flicker of life in the overwhelming dark. Winona looked around at the vast, empty landscape. She was alone with this broken man, this branded outcast. Dragging him back to her sheltera, small hidden dugout she had fortified against the elements, was a monumental risk. If the men who did this returned, they would find them both. But the alternative was to leave him here, a meal for the wolves that would begin to sing their chilling songs as dusk fell. She looked down at his face, pushing the matted hair away from his forehead. He was younger than she had first thought, his features drawn and pale beneath a layer of dirt and blood. There were lines of hardship around his eyes, but not the cruel hardness she saw in the faces of the men who passed through the trading posts. She saw only suffering. With a sigh that seemed to pull up the last of her reserves, she made her decision. She could not leave him. Whatever his story, whatever the consequences, his fate was now entwined with hers. She grabbed him under the arms, the muscles in her back and shoulders straining, and began the slow, grueling task of dragging him away from the shadow of the cottonwood tree and toward the fragile sanctuary she called home. The silence of the plains was broken only by the sound of his body scraping against the unforgiving earth. The shelter was little more than a den, dug into the side of a hill and reinforced with scavenged timber and packed earth. A thick hide served as a door, and a small, carefully vented fire pit in the center provided the only warmth. It smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the damp scent of the earth itself. It was her entire world, and bringing the stranger into it felt like a profanation, a violation of a sacred, lonely space. She laid him on her own sleeping pallet of furs near the fire pit. His breath was shallow, his skin cold to the touch. For the next several hours, she worked with a detached, methodical focus, pushing aside the turmoil in her mind. She cleaned the angry, weeping brand with a decoction of yarrow to stave off infection, her touch gentle despite the revulsion the wound inspired. It was a mark of profound cruelty, a story of pain she could read all too well. She forced sips of lukewarm water between his cracked lips and covered him with every spare blanket and hide she owned. Pace sections, his unconsciousness was a kind of mercy. It allowed her to tend to him without the complication of words, without having to face the man attached to the body. He was simply a task, a problem to be solved. But as the night deepened and the fire cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls, the silence began to feel different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of another person's breathing, a fragile rhythm that altered the very character of her solitude. He drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. During his brief, fevered moments of awareness, his eyes, startling, pale blue, would fix on her with a dazed confusion, sometimes with a flash of fear. He spoke only in broken murmurs, fragments of words that made no sense. "Water," he rasped once, his voice a dry whisper. She gave it to him, cold. He shivered, though he was wrapped in thick furs. She added more wood to the fire. On the third morning, she awoke to find him watching her. The fever had broken, and the confusion in his eyes had been replaced by a wary, searching intelligence. He had pushed himself up slightly on one elbow, his gaze fixed on her as she sat across the small space, mending a tear in a rabbit-skin glove. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. "Where?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "My home," she said, her voice quiet, unused to conversation. She did not offer more. He looked around the small dugout, taking in the earthen walls, the neatly stacked firewood, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. His gaze fell to his own chest, where her poultice of herbs covered the brand. He winced, a flicker of pain and shame crossing his features. You cut me down," he stated, more to himself than to her. Winona merely nodded, her fingers never ceasing their work with the needle and sinew. She would not make this easy for him. She had saved his life, but that did not make him a friend. He was still a white man, an unknown quantity, a source of potential danger. "Why?" he asked, the word raw. She paused her sewing and finally met his eyes. Her own gaze was dark and unreadable. "The men who did that," she said, her voice flat. "I do not like them." It was the simplest truth, and yet it seemed to satisfy him. He sank back down onto the furs, a deep sigh shuddering through his body. He was too weak to press for more. They fell back into silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of two people in a shared space, aware of each other in a way that was both uncomfortable and unavoidable. His name, she learned, was Isaac Callahan. He offered it a day later, in a quiet, halting exchange. He did not offer his story, and she did not ask for it. The brand on his chest spoke loudly enough. It told a tale of forbidden connection, of crossing boundaries that his world and hers deemed inviolable. She wondered about the woman. Was she Lakota? Cheyenne? Had he loved her? Was she the reason he was hanging from that tree? The questions hovered in the small space between them, unanswered. As Isaac slowly regained his strength, a new, awkward routine established itself. He was weak, but not idle. He would insist on helping, his movements slow and deliberate. He would feed the fire, his hands clumsy with the tongs she had fashioned from green wood. He would try to clean the bowls she used for their sparse meals of rabbit stew and root vegetables, his pride refusing to let him be a complete burden. Winona watched him, her suspicion warring with a grudging respect. He did not carry the arrogance she associated with white men. There was a quiet humility about him, a deep-seated sorrow in his eyes that she recognized. It was the look of someone who had lost everything. He never complained about the meager food or the cramped, dark shelter. He accepted what she offered with a quiet "thank you" that seemed to hold a world of gratitude. One evening, as a late spring snowstorm raged outside, trapping them in the dugout, he spoke without being prompted. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and the flickering firelight made the small space feel like the last safe place on earth. "Her name was Soteo," he said, his voice low and rough. He was staring into the flames, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of herbal tea. Winona looked up from the basket she was weaving. She remained silent, giving him the space to continue or not. "She was Cheyenne," he went on, his gaze distant. "She taught me the names of the stars, said they were a map for the spirits. I worked on the Vance Ranch, north of here. Her people were camped nearby for the winter." A shadow passed over his face, deep and painful. "Mr. Vance, he and his sons, they don't believe in mixing." He didn't need to say more. Winona could piece together the rest of the grim story. A stolen courtship, a discovery, the rage of men who saw the world in black and white, in settler and savage. "Is she?" Winona began, her voice softer than she intended. Isaac shook his head, a single, sharp gesture of negation. "They drove her people off, burned their camp, told me they killed her. I don't know if it's true. I fought them. Fought them hard." He touched his chest, a phantom pain flickering in his eyes. This was their answer. They wanted me to die slow, a warning to any other man who forgot his place. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Winona felt a shift inside her. The abstract story burned onto his skin now had a name, a face, a history. It was a story of love and hate, a story that mirrored her own losses in ways that were both different and painfully the same. She, too, had lost her family to the unreasoning hatred of men like Vance. She reached out and placed a small piece of dried fruit on the flat stone beside him. It was a simple gesture, a wordless offering of comfort. He looked at it, then up at her, and in his pale blue eyes, she saw a flicker of something beyond gratitude. It was understanding. He saw her, truly saw her, not as an Indian, but as a person who understood his grief. The snowstorm lasted for 3 days. In the enforced intimacy of the shelter, the walls of suspicion began to crumble, worn down by shared silence and small, necessary acts of cooperation. He told her about his life before, a farm back east, a family lost to sickness, a westward journey in search of a new beginning that had led him here. She, in turn, found herself speaking of things she had not spoken of in years. She told him about her younger brother, who had loved to track rabbits, and the lullabies her mother used to sing. She did not speak of the soldiers or the fire or the long, desperate journey that had brought her to this lonely hill. But she gave him pieces of the life that had existed before the silence. They were two people from warring worlds, pushed together by violence and circumstance, and in the heart of that desolation, a fragile seed of connection had taken root. The brand on his chest was no longer just a symbol of his past transgression, it was the scar that had led him to her door. And for the first time in a very long time, Winona did not feel entirely alone. The silence in her home was no longer empty, it held the quiet promise of a shared dawn. The days that followed the storm settled into a new rhythm, one of fragile peace. Isaac, now stronger, took on more of the daily chores. He chopped firewood with a surprising efficiency, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady counterpoint to the whispering wind. He learned to check her snares, his movements becoming less clumsy and more attuned to the quiet language of the wilderness. He never ventured far, always staying within sight of the shelter, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that still lurked beyond their small patch of land. Their conversations remained sparse, but the silences were now comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that needed no words. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, he carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, she weaving reeds into a sturdy basket. In these moments, they were not a white man and an Indian woman. They were just Isaac and Winona, two survivors finding a strange sort of solace in each other's company. He had a way of looking at her, a gentleness in his pale eyes that unsettled her. It was a look that saw past the hardened exterior she presented to the world. He saw the woman she had once been, the woman she had forgotten how to be. One afternoon he found her staring at a small beaded pouch she kept tucked away. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, sitting down a respectful distance from her. "My mother made it," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The pattern is the path of the river near our winter camp. She said as long as I had it, I could always find my way home." A profound sadness settled over her. Home was a place that no longer existed. It was a ghost, a memory. Isaac said nothing for a long moment. Then, very softly, he said, "Maybe home isn't a place you find. Maybe it's something you make." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She looked at him, at his earnest face, and the sorrow that still lingered in his eyes. He understood. He too was unhomed, adrift in a world that had cast him out. In that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. He was not a threat, he was her kin, not in blood, but in loss. But the world they had built was a fragile bubble, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before it burst. The threat of Vance and his sons was a constant, unspoken shadow at the edge of their awareness. They would not have left a job half-finished. They would be searching, convinced that the wilderness had claimed Isaac's life. But their certainty would not last forever. The first sign of trouble came not as a shout or a gunshot, but as a faint trace on the horizon, a plume of dust that did not belong to the wind. Winona saw it from the crest of the hill where she went to gather sage. It was far to the north, in the direction of the Vance Ranch. Riders, too many to be a simple patrol. She hurried back to the shelter, her heart a cold knot in her stomach. "They're coming," she said, her voice low and urgent as she pushed through the hide flap. Isaac was instantly on his feet, the piece of wood he was carving falling to the floor, the color drained from his face, replaced by a grim resolve. "How many?" "I saw 4, maybe more." "Vance," he breathed, the name a curse. "And his boys. They've come to make sure I'm dead." His gaze met hers, and in it she saw not just fear, but a fierce protectiveness. "You have to go," he said. "Get away from here. This is my fight, not yours." Winona shook her head, a stubborn fire igniting in her chest. "This is my home," she said, the words surprising her with their ferocity. "I will not run from it, not again." Her eyes swept over the small dugout, the place that had been her refuge. Isaac's words from the day before echoed in her mind. "Maybe home is something you make." She had made this place. She would not let them destroy it. "And you are not strong enough to face them alone," she added, her tone leaving no room for argument. A desperate plan began to form in her mind, born of her intimate knowledge of this land. The terrain itself would be their weapon. The rocky hills, the dense thickets of chokecherry, the treacherous game trails, these were her allies. "We will not fight them here," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This place is too open. We will lead them into the broken lands to the west. I know a place, a maze of canyons. They will follow. Their anger will make them reckless." Isaac listened, his expression shifting from despair to a flicker of hope. He trusted her. He had seen her strength, her wisdom. He nodded slowly. "Tell me what to do." They worked quickly, a seamless team united by a single purpose. They gathered what little they could carry: water skins, dried meat, her knife, his small carving. Winona took a moment to smudge the traces of their fire, to make the shelter look as if it had been abandoned for some time. It was a faint hope, but it was something. Then they moved. Winona led the way, setting a pace that was swift but silent. Isaac followed, his long strides eating up the ground. He was no longer the broken man she had cut down from the tree. There was a strength in his step, a purpose in his eyes. He was fighting not just for his own life now, but for hers, for the fragile peace they had found together. They made for the west, leaving a trail that was just obvious enough for an experienced tracker to follow. It was a lure, a deliberate invitation into her territory. As they ran, the sky began to bruise into the colors of sunset, painting the vast landscape in hues of orange and purple. It was beautiful and terrible, the world seeming to hold its breath before the coming storm. They reached the edge of the broken lands as twilight deepened into night. Before them lay a labyrinth of steep-sided arroyos and shadowy canyons, a place where a man could get lost for days. Winona paused, listening. Far behind them, she could hear the faint, muffled sound of horses' hooves. They had found the trail. "They are coming," Isaac said, his hand instinctively going to his chest, to the scarred flesh that had started this all. "Let them come," Winona replied, her voice a low whisper in the growing dark. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the last vestiges of daylight. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say. The land will protect us." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her dark eyes, and nodded. He owed this woman his life. He would not fail her now. Together, they descended into the shadows of the canyons, vanishing into the embrace of the earth like ghosts. The hunt had begun. The canyons were a world of their own, a confusing network of stone and shadow under the cold light of a sliver moon. Winona moved through the darkness with an assurance that was almost supernatural. She knew every turn, every dead end, every hidden passage. The land was not just a map in her mind, it was a part of her. Isaac followed so closely that he could feel the warmth radiating from her back, trusting her guidance implicitly. Behind them, the sounds of their pursuers grew louder, echoing strangely off the canyon walls. The men were clumsy, their horses skittish in the unfamiliar terrain. Shouted curses and the clatter of dislodged stones announced their progress. They were city men, ranchmen, used to open spaces where power was measured by the speed of a horse and the accuracy of a gun. Here, in the tight, winding corridors of the earth, they were blind and vulnerable. Winona led them on a winding, circular path, doubling back on their own trail, drawing the horsemen deeper into the labyrinth. Her plan was not to confront them directly, but to separate them, to use the land to pick them apart, one by one. She stopped at a narrow fork in the canyon. "Climb," she whispered to Isaac, pointing to a series of handholds carved into the rock face by centuries of wind and water. "Wait for me at the top of the ridge. Do not make a sound." He hesitated, not wanting to leave her. "Winona." "Go," she insisted, her voice sharp with urgency. "They will see my tracks leading this way. They will follow. You must be gone." He saw the unwavering resolve in her face and did as he was told, scrambling up the rock face with a silent agility he hadn't known he possessed. From the top of the narrow ridge he peered down, his heart pounding against his ribs. He watched as Winona continued down one fork of the canyon, her solitary figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Minutes later, the first of the riders appeared. It was a large, brutish man Isaac recognized as one of Vance's sons. He dismounted, studying the ground with a lantern. "She went this way." He bellowed back to the others. "The tracks are fresh." He plunged into the canyon after her, his arrogance making him careless. Isaac held his breath. He heard a faint scuffling sound from below, a choked cry, and then silence. A terrible, heavy silence. He waited, his muscles screaming with tension. A few moments later, Winona emerged from the shadows of the canyon fork and began to climb the rock face toward him. Her face was grim, but her eyes were clear. She had not killed the man, he knew instinctively. She had incapacitated him, using a pressure point, a well-aimed blow, something to neutralize the threat without taking a life unless absolutely necessary. They continued this grim dance through the night. Winona would create a diversion, a set of misleading tracks, a sound in the distance, luring another of the men away from the group. She moved like a phantom, using her knowledge of the acoustics of the canyons to throw her voice, to make a single person sound like a group, or to create an eerie silence where there should be noise. Isaac's role was to wait, to watch, to be her silent partner, his presence a steady anchor in the terrifying darkness. Finally, only two men remained, the patriarch, Mr. Vance, and his eldest son, a man whose cruel face was burned into Isaac's memory. They were more cautious now, moving together, their fear making them more dangerous. They found one of their fallen men, groaning and disoriented at the bottom of a ravine, and their rage escalated. "Witch!" Vance roared, his voice echoing through the canyons. "Indian witch! Show yourself! Show us the man you're hiding!" Winona and Isaac were pressed into a narrow crevice high on a canyon wall, the words washing over them. Isaac felt a tremor of rage run through him. He wanted to leap down, to face the man who had ordered him branded, to make him pay for Sotayo, for Winona, for everything. But he felt Winona's hand on his arm, a firm, steadying pressure. Not yet. They had reached the heart of her trap. It was a large, bowl-shaped canyon that the Lakota called the Place of Whispering Winds. The wind funneled through it in a way that created strange, sighing echoes and carried sound for great distances. At one end was a steep, seemingly impassable rock slide. "We go there," Winona whispered, pointing toward the rock slide. "There is a way through, a small tunnel near the base. They will think we are trapped." It was their final gambit. They scrambled down into the bowl of the canyon, making enough noise to be heard. As they had anticipated, Vance and his son spurred their horses forward, their faces lit with triumphant hate as they saw their prey cornered against the rock slide. "Nowhere left to run, Callahan," Vance shouted, raising his rifle. "We should have cut your throat right at the start. And as for your squaw—" Isaac stepped forward, placing himself in front of Winona. His body was a shield, his posture defiant. The man who had been left to die on a tree was gone. In his place stood someone who had found something to live for, to die for. "Leave her out of this, Vance," Isaac said, his voice ringing with a strength that surprised even himself. "Your quarrel is with me." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My quarrel is with anyone who forgets their place. You defiled yourself. She is an animal. You will die together." He aimed his rifle, but as he did, a sound began to build around them. It started as a low rumble and grew into a deafening roar. Isaac looked at Winona, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. High above them, on the ridge overlooking the rock slide, a series of precariously balanced boulders, held in place by a single, cleverly cut log, began to shift. Winona had prepared this place long ago, a final defense for her home. All it took was severing one last rope, a task she had completed before they descended. The rock slide began. It was not an avalanche, but a controlled, thundering cascade of rock and scree, pouring down the side of the canyon, not where they stood, but directly in the path of Vance and his son. Cutting off their advance, their horses reared in panic, throwing both men to the ground. Rocks rained down around them, and a massive cloud of dust filled the canyon, choking the air. When the dust began to settle, Vance and his son were trapped on the far side of a massive, impassable wall of rock. Their horses were gone, bolted in terror. They were alive, but they were defeated. Disarmed, unhorsed, and lost deep in a hostile wilderness they did not understand. Their reign of terror was over. Winona grabbed Isaac's hand. "Now," she said. She pulled him toward the hidden opening at the base of the slide. They slipped through the narrow tunnel, emerging on the other side into the cool, clean air of the pre-dawn light. Behind them, they could hear Vance's faint, enraged screams, swallowed by the uncaring stone. They did not look back. They walked eastward, toward the rising sun, their hands still clasped together. The ordeal was over. They had faced the darkness and survived. They had won. They returned to the shelter as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. The world felt new, washed clean by the violence of the night. The small dugout, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt like a true sanctuary, a place of safety they had earned and defended together. Isaac collapsed onto the furs, his body humming with exhaustion and adrenaline. Winona moved to the fire pit, her hands automatically beginning the familiar motions of rekindling the embers. But this time, the simple domestic act felt different. It was not a chore done for survival, but an affirmation of life, of continuity. He watched her, his heart full of a feeling he could not name. It was more than gratitude, more than respect. In the crucible of the canyons, their separate struggles had fused into a single shared existence. She had saved his life not once, but twice. She had shown him a courage and wisdom that humbled him. "Winona," he said, his voice quiet in the still morning air. She turned from the fire to look at him. "Thank you," he said. The words were inadequate, a pebble trying to describe a mountain, but they were all he had. She gave a small nod, accepting his gratitude as she had accepted everything else, with a quiet, powerful grace. She came and sat near him, tending to a long scratch on his arm he hadn't even noticed he'd received. Her touch was gentle, her focus absolute. "The Vances will not trouble anyone again," she said softly. "The wilderness will be their prison. If they survive, they will not return." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, listening to the fire crackle to life. The threat that had hung over them was gone, leaving a vacuum in its place. A question hung in the air, unspoken but potent. What now? The shelter was safe again, but they both knew things had changed irrevocably. Her solitude had been broken forever. His past had been confronted and defeated. They were no longer the same people who had met under the shadow of that cottonwood tree. "I can't stay here," Isaac finally said, the words costing him. "It isn't right. I've brought you nothing but trouble. I'll move on. Head west. California, maybe." He couldn't meet her eyes as he spoke. The thought of leaving felt like tearing something vital from his own chest. Winona was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "This land is all I have known. To leave is to be a ghost again." "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I am sorry, Winona, for all of it." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You said home is something you make," she reminded him gently. The memory of his own words hung between them. He looked around the small, earthen-walled shelter. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the resilience that seemed woven into her very being. He had come here as a broken man, branded and discarded by his own kind. And in this unlikely place, with this unlikely woman, he had been remade. He had found a strength he didn't know he had, a purpose he thought he had lost forever. Leaving would not be a new beginning. It would be a return to the emptiness. "I was wrong," he said softly. "Staying here, it's the only thing that feels right." He hesitated, his heart in his throat. If you'll have me." A slow warmth spread through Winona's chest, a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever. It was hope. For years she had survived, she had endured, but she had not truly lived. With Isaac, in the midst of fear and danger, she had felt more alive than she had in a decade. His presence had not been a disruption to her peace, it had been the end of her loneliness. She reached out and laid her hand over his. Her skin was warm against his. It was an answer more powerful than any word. They did not need to speak of love or promises. Their bond had been forged in shared trauma, tempered in conflict, and sealed in mutual respect. It was a connection that ran deeper than words, a quiet understanding that they belonged together. In the weeks and months that followed, they built a new life in the shadow of the hills. They reinforced the shelter, expanding it, making it a true home. He taught her the clumsy English words for things she had only known in Lakota, and she taught him the secrets of the land, which roots were sweet, which berries were poison, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. The brand on his chest healed, leaving a pale, puckered scar, a permanent reminder of the hatred that had nearly killed him. But it was no longer a mark of shame. It was a map of his journey, the brutal path that had, against all odds, led him to his salvation, to his home. They lived a quiet life, a world unto themselves in the vastness of the plains. Sometimes from the high ridges they would see riders in the distance, but no one ever bothered them again. They were a myth, a ghost story whispered around far-off campfires, the branded man and the Indian witch who had vanished into the hills. One evening, sitting outside their home, they watched the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. Isaac, who now knew their Cheyenne names, pointed them out to her. "That one," he said, his arm around her shoulder, "is the home of the spirits." Winona leaned her head against him, a feeling of profound peace settling over her. She looked at the scarred man beside her, the man her world was supposed to hate and his was supposed to despise. They were an impossible pairing, an affront to the cruel logic of the world beyond their hills. But here, together, under the vast, silent watch of the stars, they made perfect sense. She no longer needed the beaded pouch to find her way. She was already home.